Dear students, friends and colleagues, after studying this module, you shall be able to understand and grasp. Number 1, know the development of psychological thoughts and ethnocentric attitudes within the mainstream psychology. Number 2, understand the orientations in understanding the psychological constructs. And finally, number 3, understand the historical development of cross-cultural psychology. Development of psychological thoughts. Looking back at the historical development of the subject matter in psychology, it was influenced by ethics of philosophy and physiology. However, to attain status, psychology in its modern era proved its subject matter closer to science and searched for an absolute truth. Currently, psychology as a science is facing a lot of criticism, especially on the orientation of absolutism. Therefore, psychology is moving towards an orientation that is relative in nature. They emphasized the importance of idiographic data, which led to the rise of subject matter in psychology that is relative in nature. The mainstream psychology has been influenced by rules and laws of scientific paradigm. The effects of such influence had been seen in the theories and laws developed in its subject matter. The researchers in the laboratory setting, in the controlled environment, developed a psychology that is culture-free and absolute its approach. Developing countries had further taken this mainstream psychology as a package and transported the concepts without realizing that these theories may not be applicable in their context. The complexities of human development had been reduced to the findings of the experiments and tests in the labs. This attitude resulted in ethnocentrism in psychology. The differential evaluation of different groups is known as ethnocentrism, since investigators groups show themselves superior to the other groups in different culture. It is having negative connotations in the academic world. A hierarchy is created by researchers and the standard is construed that favors the few in the cultures. Hence, the diversity is disdained in the whole process of making one's nose up vis-a-vis other cultures. To overcome the tradition of ethnocentrism, researchers in psychology had attempted to develop the subject matter that should be sensitive to the culture of each human being. This means each culture has its own indigenous concepts, tools, idiographic data. This revolution had led to emergence of fields like cultural psychology, cross-cultural psychology, and indigenous psychology that is relative in nature. In process, there is an unseen continuous tug of war between two strands, that is absolutism versus relativism. Both strands have its own limitation and can impact psychology in a larger way. There is a neutral point of view in this continuum of relativity and absolutism, that is universality. This model is going to examine the three perspectives in detail and stands that psychology had taken in these three perspectives, especially in context of cross-cultural psychology paradigm.
Psychologists observed three standpoint or general orientations towards understanding psychological constructs: absolutism, universalism, relativism. Absolutism. The first standpoint is absolutism. This standpoint assumes psychological phenomena are qualitatively small in all cultures. For example, according to this perspective, constructs like honesty, happy are absolutely same in all cultures. Thus, culture seems to play no role in bringing difference in the meaning. This standpoint is charged to take ethnocentric predilections while studying human behavior. The meaning favors few in some ethnic groups, especially white middle class men in Western cultures, who were conducting most of their researches. Rest were shown an inferior as the meaning of the construct didn't favor the other ethnic group. Relativism. The second standpoint is relativism. Relativism assumes that human behavior is culturally patterned. This view attempts to avoid ethnocentrism as this standpoint respects human diversity. However, in such a stand, it faces difficulties in looking for any measurement techniques that can assess two cultures at place. Thus, a lot of methodological and conceptual challenges stand in front of relativism. Universalism, the third standpoint, attempts to balance the orientations of absolutism and relativism, known as universalism. According to this standpoint, though psychological phenomena are uniform, the display and development is varied from culture to culture. It therefore endeavor to observe behavioral similarities, universals, and behavioral difference, specifics, across different cultures. Hence, this standpoint does not miss the role of culture in the global understanding of human behavior. Inspired by mainstream scientific psychology of Western countries, absolutism is an orientation that was dominant in modern era. This orientation assumes that human behavior is guided by a common element, that is, some form of psychic unity is observed between all human beings that binds them together across cultures. Absolutism tries to eliminate culture. This orientation reinforced using laboratory experiment as a scientific tool to examine human behavior. Researcher took outsider's perspective to examine his subject. Researchers, following this orientation, believe that culture is nuisance and acts as an obstacle to attain the true psychic unity. Thus, culture should be controlled. Researchers favoring proposition of absolutism attempts to reduce the variations in behavior and experience to one specific psychological unit. Earlier, schools of psychology like structuralism, behaviorism, and cognitive psychology supported absolutist orientation. They believed this orientation favors psychology in gaining respectful scientific position in academic world. However, this proliferated insensitive attitude towards variation in human beings due to culture, environment, and historical event and created ethnocentric attitude. Contrary to absolutism, relativism has emerged as a reaction against ethnocentrism in social sciences. Gellner, 1985, asserted that there is no absolute truth, be it ethical, moral, or cultural, and there is no meaningful way to judge different cultures because all judgments are ethnocentric. There is a continuum of relativism ranging from descriptive relativism, which is the weakest form of relativism, to extreme form of relativism, that is, epistemological relativism. Jarvie, 1983, and Spiro, 1984 to 1986, observed that relativism can be seen in 3 point scale, whereby descriptive relativism is the weakest form of relativism. In descriptive relativism, researcher describes the common sense variations that are observed in society. The focus is on the methodology of describing the variations. However, there is an underlying assumption that few things are common in many cultures. The second level in the scale is normative relativism. This form of relativism is much more stringent than the previous one. Normative relativism posits that all standards are culture bound. There can be no transcultural moral or ethnic standards. Finally, epistemological relativism is extreme form of relativism, claims that humans are shaped exclusively by their culture and therefore there exist no unifying cross-cultural human characteristics. An interdisciplinary field that supports relativism orientation is cultural psychology. Cultural psychology emphasizes relativistic stand, argued that each culture is unique. Schweder and Sullivan, 1993, and hence no comparison could be made between two cultures. Ethnographic studies are most popular method of inquiry used by cultural psychologists. Researchers used insiders' perspective in such method of inquiry. He is supposed to stay within a culture for a long period of time to understand the true nature of psychological phenomena of each individual within the culture. Social constructionism is another theoretical approach in psychology that follows this orientation. Social constructionism assumes that reality is constructed, rather, discovered and invented by the human being. For example, the table is known as table because the name table is constructed, and the meaning of this object, table, is socially communicated by the people to others and is transmitted from one generation to another. There is, as such, no fixed universal substance called table existing. Therefore, the same objects have different names in different cultures. Similarly, human behaviors are solely explained through socio-cultural and historical events that impinge upon the experiences of the people. Universalism is an orientation that considered the principles of relativism and absolutism and looked for the common elements that could be observed across cultures. This orientation assumes that human beings have commonalities that unites psyche of all human beings. However, culture creates variation among the human behavior. The goal of psychologists is to develop those methodologies and scientific tool that is culture sensitive. These methodologies can result to the subject matter in psychology that can be universally generalized to each human being across cultures. Cross cultural psychology is an interdisciplinary field that supports universalism orientation. The goal of cross cultural psychology can be explained in three steps. Firstly, to transport knowledge of psychological construct from one culture to another and verify the nature and existence of that construct. Secondly, discover and explore new aspects about construct being studied through adapted instruments. Finally, to integrate information received from the first two aspects to reach towards the universal knowledge. Cross cultural psychology is also the study of similarities and differences in individual psychological functioning in various cultural and ethnocultural groups. The relationships between psychological variables and sociocultural, ecological, and biological variables, and the ongoing changes in psychological, sociocultural, ecological, and biological variables. Cross cultural psychology can have the following assumptions now must be made. All behavior is learned and occurs in a cultural context. Culture must be accounted for in psychological theories. More understanding of cultural influences on behavior is necessary, which may change the way of behavior is studied. Cross-cultural psychologists uses adapted versions of standardized instrument to study any constructs. For example, in context of emotion, there are only four basic emotions: happy, sad, afraid, surprised, and angry, disgusted. However, other forms of emotions are affected by culture, environment, and socialization in immediate settings. Finally, there are few points on which we can differentiate three standpoints. A. In defining concepts, absolutists define concept that doesn't account context of the individual at all. Universalists are sensitive to the context and thus attempts to construct the definition that is sensitive to all the contexts. However, relativists construct context bound definition of the concepts. B. As a researcher, absolutists are trained to be an outsider, detached from all emotions while pursuing research. Universalists attempt to strike balance between insiders and outsiders' perspective. That is, they are aware of the context and the nuances of the processes involved in the context. However, the relativists are trained to be an insider who perceive and examine the objects closely by living within the context. C. For the assessment of the constructs, absolutist uses standardized instruments for assessing the constructs. Universalists adapt instruments for assessments of the constructs. Finally, relativist uses local instruments that are contextualized and specific to the context in which research is performed. D. In corollary, the measurement of constructs are context free in the research taking absolutist orientation, context sensitive in taking research universalist orientation, and context bound in research taking relativist orientation. E. The methods of inquiry employed by absolutists are experimental in nature, laboratory versus field, etc., whereby one tests the effect of independent variable on dependent variable. Universalists generally uses methods whereby the blend of ethnographic and experimentation is involved. The emic ethic approach as a method of inquiry is popular in cross cultural psychology. Lastly, relativist employs ethnographic studies as a method of inquiry. F. While understanding the status of culture, culture is controlled and believed to be nuisance in absolutist orientation. In universalist orientation, culture is studied as a product, while in relativist orientation, culture is studied as the process. G. Thus, comparison of culture is straightforward and evaluative in absolutist perspective, while controlled and non evaluative in universalist perspective. Relativists usually avoid any comparison and therefore are exhibit non-evaluative attitude in comparing the culture studied. H. Culture is controlled and is believed to be a nuisance in absolutism, whereas universalists believe culture as a product that can be studied. On the other hand, relativists view culture as a process. I. In corollary, ethnocentric attitude is prevalent in absolutists' perspective. Universalists needs to be cautious about ethnocentric attitude while relativists exhibit least possibility on ethnocentric attitude.
To summarize what you have learned in this module, number one, psychology first emerged as an ethics to philosophy and physiology, but is lately working towards. Number two, to overcome the ethnocentric attitude, researchers are working towards a subject matter more sensitive towards different cultures. And third, three standpoints of psychological construct: absolutism, relativism, and universalism. 4. Development of methodologies and scientific tools that are culture sensitive and can result to the subject matter that can be universally generalized to each human being is required. Thank you.